Good evening. I don't know if you know this, but today is what a lot of the world refers to as Palm Sunday, which doesn't mean much of anything to me personally. I don't do anything special the Sunday before Easter. I don't dress any differently. I don't act any differently. You won't catch me in the parking lot trimming the palm fronds and doing arts and crafts. It's just another Sunday where we get to gather together and worship our Lord. But across the world, people are reading the account of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And that's actually where I want to start this evening. I want to begin in Matthew 21. I want to look at the reaction that the crowd had when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. But what I want to focus on tonight is their misguided expectations. Because I don't think they were cheering for the Messiah, or at least I don't think they were cheering for the real Messiah that Jesus was, that Jesus is. I think they were cheering for what I'm going to call tonight the John Wayne Messiah. Someone who didn't exist. And let me explain. Picture the old Westerns. John Wayne or some other tall, rugged figure rides into town. There's dust in the air. His hat is pulled low. A tall, strong horse beneath him, and there's trouble in town. And the townsfolk are waiting for him to come in and clean it up. He's the kind of hero who doesn't say much, but you know he's about to bring justice in his own different kind of way. Now picture the people of Jerusalem. This is the expectation that they had. The Romans were this occupying force. The priests were corrupt. The people were exhausted. They needed somebody to come in and clean up this mess. They wanted somebody with power and presence and force, and they've heard of Jesus' miracles, his authority, his power. They've heard of his followers, and they're ready for their hero to come in and clean up the mess that is all around them, to kick out the Romans, to restore Israel to glory, to establish this powerful earthly kingdom. But instead of John Wayne on a horse, they see Jesus on a donkey, already subverting these expectations. I want to start, as I already said, in Matthew 21. I want to read the first 11 verses. And then we're going to go back to Zechariah chapter 9 and read the prophecy that Matthew is quoting here. So now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you'll find a donkey tied, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he'll send them at once." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of beasts of burden." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." Everyone seems awfully excited for this new king entering Jerusalem. And while I'd like to believe that they were excited because they knew of the great sacrifice that he was going to make, and they knew of this new covenant he was going to bring, that they knew of this Jesus, this true, real Messiah that he was, I don't think that's the case. Because they didn't want Jesus. They wanted a hero dispersing vigilante justice. They wanted John Wayne. They wanted somebody to kick out the Romans, someone who would disrupt by force, someone who would put the Hebrew people back on top again. And when they realized that Jesus was not that guy, they killed him. Which begs the question, how did they get so confused? How did they become so desperate that they changed the Messiah from what was prophesied to what they wanted? And do we do the same thing? Do we become so desperate that we believe in the God or the Messiah that we want to believe in, who's going to solve all of our problems, and we ignore what the Bible tells us? So tonight I want to look at Zechariah chapter 9. I want to look at verses 9 through 13, and I want to read more of this prophecy that Jesus is fulfilling during his entry into Jerusalem, because it seems awfully hard for them to have missed the point so greatly. So we're going to start in verse 9, and we're only going to read half of the verse. But before we get into it, I want to point out that if this was a John Wayne film, this is the part where the hero is righteous because he can outshoot the villain. He rides in with his own sense of justice, and it's clear wrongdoers are going to get what's coming to them. But that's not what we see. Zechariah 9, first half of verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he. Jesus rides in to bear the justice that we deserve. He's not dishing out justice, because if he was dishing out justice, none of us would be here today. We would all be at fault. We would all get what we were deserving, which is eternal death. And yet, Jesus isn't John Wayne. He's the King of righteousness and salvation. He bears the justice that we deserve. His righteousness isn't about punishing others. It's about saving us from ourselves, from our own sin. And Zechariah here is prophesying to a discouraged people who are returning from exile, and they needed hope. They needed to know that a righteous king was coming, that righteousness here, that it means moral perfection, that it means justice, that it's alignment with God's holiness, and salvation is going to be delivered to them from this righteous king. And yet, by the time we get to Jesus, they wanted justice, but the justice they imagined wasn't justice that God knows. It was political and it was immediate. They wanted saved, but not from their own sins. They wanted saved from a present, real force. They wanted saved from the Romans. And I think sometimes we too cry out, save us, we need saved. But we're not looking for salvation from ourselves or salvation from our own sins or salvation from the justice we deserve. We're looking to be saved from our discomfort, from the things of this world that at the end of the day don't really matter. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30, it says, because of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. He is our all in all. He did what we could never do, and we need to remember that. Are we asking Jesus to fix temporary problems while ignoring the eternal rescue he is offering us? Do we pray for relief from discomfort or solutions to worldly troubles, for victories that fade as soon as they are won, and then ignore the eternal nature of our predicament? That we are deserving of nothing but eternal death. And here Jesus is offering us salvation from that. And sometimes we miss it because we're so caught up in the little picture. But let's continue. Let's go ahead and read the second half of verse 9 here. Came humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, I don't think I need to tell you that that doesn't happen in the John Wayne films I've seen. If it was a John Wayne film, you expect the hero to come in tall and proud and commanding. He rides in on the stallion, and he looks good doing it. He's got his big duster coat on. He's got his hat tipped low, and you know that he's there to serve justice. And yet, Jesus chose a donkey. A donkey he didn't even own. It was a borrowed donkey. Donkeys don't ride tall. They're low. Instead of lifting himself up, portraying strength, portraying strong, rugged strength, he lowers himself and offers himself as the king of humility. And I ask, do we embrace this humility of our king, or do we still crave showy displays of power? Because I'll admit, humility is hard. Humility is hard for me, and I'll tell you why. Because humility does not make sense today in 21st century America. Because you see people who we call powerful. We see people who we call successful, and they are anything but humble, and they're powerful, and they're successful because they lack humility. And then here we see Jesus, the exact opposite of what we would call powerful, the exact opposite of what would make a man successful in 21st century America. We see humility, somebody willing to lower themselves, to lift others up. Matthew 20:28, we're told, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And Jesus corrects his disciples' craving for status on multiple occasions. And he reminds them time and time again that his mission was service. God the God of the universe, came to earth, lowered himself, became a human, the creation that has turned against him, became a lowly human at that, and continued to humble himself time and time again in that form, not to be lifted up, but to serve others. And if God, the God of the universe, can lower himself to that degree, how can we ever say that we are uncomfortable in any form of service? What right do we have to say that that is beneath us? What right do we have to ignore it or to just not do it when the God of all creation did so much more? So yeah, Jesus isn't John Wayne. He didn't come riding tall in the saddle. He didn't come looking down on the people. He came low, riding on a donkey, walking among the poor of the poor, carrying burdens, and lifting others up. But that's not all. Let's continue. Now, I'll remind you again that if this was a Western, the peace would only come after a fight. The gunslinger takes out the bad guys, and then, and only then, will the town enjoy some good peace and quiet. It's victory through violence. And the crowd in Jerusalem was hoping for victory through violence. That's what they wanted. That's what they were looking for. They were looking for a showdown. The Messiah who'd be willing to draw his sword and finally bring peace through power. But Jesus didn't do that. Zechariah 9, verse 10, I'll cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. John Wayne might have settled things with a showdown, but Jesus settled it with sacrifice. God promises that he's going to remove instruments of war, that his kingdom advances not through conflict, but through peace. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, it says, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Isaiah gives us a vision of peace for the future, where tools of war become tools for growth. They take their swords and they beat them into equipment for growth. They exchange conflict for cultivation. They become peacemakers, turning instruments of division into instruments of peace, into growth, discipleship. And so I ask, do we get so caught up in who we think we should be, or who we think somebody else should be, or who we think God should be, that we forget that he's the King of peace, that he wants unity among his people, that he wants growth? But let's continue. Verse 11. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I'll set your prisoners free from this waterless pit. He is the king who sets captives free. And again, we've already mentioned this. If this was a Western, the freedom and the peace would come at the end of a blazing gunfight. That the prison doors would be kicked in, the chains would be shot off with alarming accuracy, and the crowd expected Jesus to come in with this power of this revolutionary leader to break the Roman chains, to upset this power at B, to storm the prisons, to free them from oppression. In a sense, that's what Jesus did. But Jesus also knew that the truest captivity wasn't Roman rule. To set them free from oppression didn't mean that he needed to rescue them from the Romans. He needed to rescue them from themselves, to rescue us from the consequences of our own actions, to set us free. In Luke chapter 4, verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. It's a liberator of souls. So again, what freedom do we long for? Do we want to be free from whatever binds us here earthly? And chains can come in all sorts of forms. They come in relationships, they come in jobs, they come in the form of situations we just don't like. And do we worry so much about being freed from these man-made physical forms of captivity that we don't see at the end of the day we're slaves to the sin that consumes us? and that is the salvation that Jesus is offering. Well, let's continue. Verse 12, return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you to double. Jesus restores hope. In the movies, hope is restored when the villain is gone. The saloon is quiet, the townsfolk rebuild. It's all external. You clean up the town and hope returns. The people in Jerusalem wanted the same. Throw out the Romans, rebuild the kingdom, and let hope return to Israel. Except Jesus didn't really do that. He didn't really do anything external. That's not what he was here for. That's not the type of hope he was trying to restore. He was calling them to return to God. Even in captivity, they were called prisoners of hope because he restores what was lost. What was lost was hope. In Romans 15, verse 13, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. This prayer of blessing, our hope is not wishful thinking. Our hope is not built on physical circumstances around us. Our hope is built on our relationship with God. And that's what Jesus was restoring. And yet they weren't here for that. They didn't like it. Let's continue verse 13. Now, again, I'll preface this with traditionally, the hero steps into the street for battle. There's that lonesome whistle in the background. You hear the wind. Maybe there's a tumbleweed in the distance blowing off. Right? He faces the enemy alone to settle things once and for all. Hands on his hip, ready, pull the loaded gun. Maybe the townsfolk are watching from shuttered windows, peeking out behind barrels or bushes or shutters. Maybe they cheer him on from the sidelines, but they're not there to fight. They're not part of this battle. They're just there to watch. And yet Jesus calls his people into battle. This Messiah that was prophesied by Zechariah calls his people into battle. He calls us to join him. He doesn't call us to join with guns or fists or swords, but with faith and with truth. Verse 13, for I have bent Judah as my bow, I have made Ephraim its arrow. I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and wield you like a warrior's sword. The unexpected twist is that Jesus does fight. We talked about him being meek and humble, being lowly, lowering himself down, and yet Jesus does fight, except for it just doesn't look the way we do. It's not with weapons of war, it's with people. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Because our battle is not physical. It's spiritual. So the question is, are we fighting the right battle? In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but of divine power to destroy strongholds. So the question isn't just, are we fighting the right battle? But are we using the right weapons? Are we ready to be called to be a part of his mission, to be used by our King for victory? Now this battle, again, it's not flesh and blood, but it's the spiritual forces in darkness. And our King does not fight alone. He calls us on to the battlefield. So no, Jesus is not John Wayne. He does not fight this battle alone, but he recruits every one of us to fight it by his side. And I'll give you a little insider into where my mind has been over the past couple weeks. I've been thinking a lot about the way in which 21st century, and I'm going to use the word Christians, and I'm going to use that word loosely. If you want to imagine air quotes, how the Christian community has changed Jesus over time, historically always has, to be what works for them. How can we market Jesus in a way that appeals to the most people? And at times they have great intentions when they're doing that. They're trying to spread the gospel. But the problem with those great intentions is, no matter how great those intentions start, the second you start to change who Jesus is to better fit somebody else, you lose the message. And when you lose the message, Jesus becomes commercialized. And I say that not just in the way that they decide that they're changing him to fit a market, but they change him to make money. They write these books and they go on these tours and they sell this merchandise and they profit from it, all because somebody was uncomfortable with who Jesus was. And so they decided to change him. And then all of a sudden, those great intentions lead them down this tumbling path. And I've said I hate slippery slopes, but a slippery slope is what happens. And before you know it, the Jesus they're preaching isn't recognizable anymore. And I've been grappling with this. And I've been worrying that sometimes I wonder, am I influenced by these people who have changed Jesus so many times that when I read and when I study, am I seeing the Jesus that they're proclaiming and not the Jesus I'm reading about? And I've been struggling with that thought this week. And then I started thinking more and more about it. And I found comfort in the saddest truth, that it's not new. That this commercialized form of Jesus is not indicative or solely created by 21st century America. They were doing it then. They had the prophecy of who the Messiah was going to be. And yet they had changed it so many times to better fit the market of how they were feeling that when the Messiah actually came and said the things he was supposed to say and did the things that was prophesied that he was going to do, they didn't recognize him. They didn't want him because it wasn't who they thought he was supposed to be. They shouted Hosanna, but the more they learned of him, the more disappointed they became. So tonight I find joy in the simple truth that we can rejoice not because Jesus came in the way that we expected, that we can rejoice not because Jesus came in the way that I even could say I want. I can rejoice in the fact that Jesus came in the way I needed. That despite what my own desires are, despite the Jesus that has been passed along for centuries at this point, and changed and changed and changed, the Jesus who came is the Jesus we need. The Messiah that God sent down to earth was perfect in every way. And while he might not look like how you'd expect him to look, what he did changed the course of human history. Not only does it change the course of human history, it changes the course of eternal history, right? Because it changes the predicament we find ourselves in. I've been calling it a predicament, this eternal predicament. The truth of the matter is, I am a sinner, and there is nothing I deserve when this life ends but eternal damnation. Nothing. And there's nothing that I can do about my predicament to change that result. That if it was left solely to me, and I were to die, I deserve nothing but eternal damnation. And yet, this Messiah who came, who humbled himself down to show us a better way of living, showed us a better way of dying too, because he sacrificed his life in exchange for our eternal salvation, that he gave himself up so that we have an opportunity at everlasting life. During the Beatitudes in Luke 6:23, we're told, "Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. So their fathers did to the prophets." And Jesus is saying this right after he says the whole, "Blessed are the poor and the hungry and the saddened and the hated. Blessed are the lowly. Blessed are the people who live like Christ lived when he was here on earth. Blessed are the people who live like this Messiah that they rejected." Because if we do, if we are hated because we live like he did, then we have reason to rejoice. That we can rejoice in the King who came and subverted expectations, because that is the King who saves. So if you're here tonight, you need the prayers of the congregation. You need somebody to sit with, to cry with, to study with, you need somebody to sit there and listen to you yell about everything wrong in the world, then now is the time to do that. But if you are here tonight and you've not yet put on Christ, if you have not yet accepted this Messiah that was rejected thousands of years ago, if you have not accepted the Jesus who came, if you've not been buried with him in baptism, if you have not yet gone down in the waters and risen up a new creation, then I ask that you do that. Find out why you haven't. But whatever your needs are, the body here can help you in any way. I ask that you come forward as we stand and sing together.
Jesus is tenderly calling thee home.